We have a climate treaty on this planet. It is a universal treaty. There are 194 parties, mostly nations, some international organizations, that are parties to it. No nation, once a party, has ever withdrawn from the Framework Convention on Climate Change. We should not be the first.
Hello and welcome everyone to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. It's our 273rd, give or take. I'm Herb Simmons, author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future, and I'm delighted to be your host today. We're especially pleased to welcome back someone who has been a regular guest and colleague of ours for many years, Mr. Dan Galpern. Dan is an environmental and climate attorney and policy analyst who has spent the last 15 years, in addition to other things he's done, as the legal and policy advisor to the renowned climate scientist, Dr. James Hansen. During that time, Dan, you've worked with Dr. Hansen on a wide range of legal actions in a lot of different places. And I counted almost a dozen U.S. states, as well as in the countries of Colombia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Uganda, and the United Kingdom. You also started and lead the Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative, and we'll post your website below our channel here. You joined us not all that long ago to discuss developments at COP30 in Belém, Brazil, and we're so glad to have you back. Today, as I understand it, you're going to help us unpack several major developments, including the landmark International Court of Justice decision clarifying states' obligations with respect to climate change, and the recent unfortunate withdrawal by the Trump White House from the UNFCCC and what that means for global climate governance going forward. Joining Dan are two of our regular distinguished panelists, Dr. Peter Carter, retired physician from British Columbia, founder of the Climate Emergency Institute, and expert reviewer for the IPCC. And we're also joined by Paul Beckwith, climate system scientist from Ottawa, longtime university lecturer, and host of a prolific and widely followed YouTube channel that explores every dimension of the climate crisis, now with more than 11 million views. And as always, don't forget to like this channel, to subscribe, to go to our website, climateemergencyforum.org. We would appreciate any donations you could give so that we can continue to doing this vital public service on the climate emergency there. And as always, I'll close today's program with what we call the Climate Five, the 5 most important climate stories of the past week, each guaranteed to be less than 1 minute. So please stay with us through the end. So with that, I'm simply going to welcome you, Dan. Tell us a little bit about what you've been up to and sort of what's a message that you want to convey to us today, and then we'll turn it over to Peter and Paul.
Well, certainly, there's a lot to be concerned with respect to developments out of Washington, D.C., and in particular the White House. The topics that we will be discussing in detail today perhaps are not the chief among those in the short term, but perhaps the most important in the long term, because the abandonment and sharp withdrawal from what some of the White House people somewhat disparagingly refer to as diplomatic niceties, but what others of us call the fundamental rules-based order for international affairs and also domestic affairs, the rule of law and democracy itself. These are critically important in the long term, and they also are the foundation for action to prevent or to reverse dangerous climate change. And you noted in your kind of introductory remarks, Herb, that I recently wrote about end of last year, so not so recent now, but about a month ago, wrote an article that was somewhat optimistic, I guess, titled When the Law Returns. There, I talked about what I think is potentially the most important and far-reaching international decision that we have had through the World Court, also known as the International Court of Justice. which at the end of July of last year took on the question, what are the obligations of states in respect of climate change? And by states, they mean nations. And important for our discussion here is their determination, their ruling that obligations of states, the fundamental duties of states to combat climate change, arise not merely from the so-called climate treaties, as they refer to it, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change being the most important one, but also the Paris Agreement to the UNFCCC. Those are fundamental sources of the obligation of states to act to arrest dangerous climate change. But that they are not the only sources. The other sources include fundamental international common law, the duty to protect your neighbor from actions that you may undertake within your jurisdiction, for example, the duty to respect the sovereignty of other nations, and so on. And so the court found that even if a nation was not a party to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement to it, or if it had been a member and exited, the fundamental duties to act strongly to phase out fossil fuels in particular, they actually address that specifically, and more generally to phase out greenhouse gas emissions in order to preserve or to restore a viable climate system, remains. And I thought that that was important to mention here now, because that perhaps forms a bit of a backdrop for considering the impact, which I think is dramatic, but still perhaps not fatal, of the Trump administration's determined to withdraw from the convention.
I'm wondering, what are the sort of practical implications of a decision like this that doesn't have a formal mechanism, as far as I understand it, for enforcement? For example, can we expect to see lawsuits being filed around the world now, maybe even by yourself and others, that reference this decision in national courts and so forth? How do these critically important words and direction get translated into action?
Yeah, first of all, most definitely, it will be possible to refer to this as a now well recognized by the most important authority in the world obligation of states in respect of climate change to work in a cooperative way to address the problem and to cease or phase out a nation's contributions to it, and also to assist other nations to eliminate their fossil fuel derived greenhouse gas emissions and other actions that are necessary to restore energy balance to Earth's system. So certainly the decision itself is not, I think, directly enforceable in any court, but it is an important source of authority on which litigants can draw, or litigants should be required to wrestle. And I think when we last spoke, Herb, I actually mentioned that at COP30, surprisingly, there was not even a mention
That's right.
of this decision in the final communique of all the nations. And that is perhaps because it was still fairly new. People didn't quite know what to do with it. It hadn't been the subject of any kind of enforcement actions. But I do expect that there will be certainly strong references to the court's judgment and determination, its advisory opinion in climate change litigation going forward.
Well, we hope that through this program and other ways to explain and promote this critically important court decision, that it will be used, and it sure is needed. And with that, I'm always happy to have Peter Carter with us, as I've introduced. So good to see you, Peter, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's always very interesting and a great pleasure to hear from Dan Galpern, who's been supporting who I think obviously is the world's top climate scientist, Dr. James Hansen, for many, many years. Dan, I'm intrigued by something that you just said about the International Court of Justice advisory. I thought I'd read it adequately, but obviously I hadn't. Is the Republican Trump administration in some way bound or obligated to at least stop increasing its greenhouse gas emissions? Is it an obligation to do something about its greenhouse gas emissions, which of course impact the atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations?
It depends on who you ask. If you ask me, yes, I think they are under a general international duty to phase out fossil fuels used in energy systems in particular, and to try to reduce to a minimum any greenhouse gas emissions stemming from a territory over which the United States has some control. This is a general obligation according to the World Court. Every nation must participate to the full extent of its capacity to address this common threat to humanity and nature as we've come to know it. And before that, I think there was that duty. Now that we have the most important authority as to international law saying this. I was concerned when this case was first submitted to the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice by the United Nations General Assembly, because I was concerned that they could punt on the issue. But they took it on directly. And in a unanimous decision, that court said these things, said that there is an international duty and it exists independently and beyond the duties that are specified in the climate treaties, and that the duty to undertake action to limit the increase in global temperatures and to limit the damage to nations and states, including especially small island developing states and other climate vulnerable nations. That duty attaches to every nation, and of course, in particular, to the nations that historically have contributed the most to the problem. The nation, by the way, that has contributed most to the problem, if you look at historical emissions, which are the emissions that matter most, the accumulation of emissions, is the United States. While we are not currently the nation responsible for the largest emissions, that honor goes to China. We are now only number 2, but if you look at emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, or even since the signing of the Framework Convention in 1992, the United States has contributed the most to the overburden of CO2 and other greenhouse gases resident in the atmosphere. And is that concentration, that increased concentration, that, as you know, Peter, so well, is a signal cause for our energy imbalance in the planet.
Another question that I have, and it regards a matter that's close to all of our hearts, which is the implications, what's going to happen to today's children and the future. We have had many cases brought to state and then up to federal court, and there's been some minor success in 2 of them, but all the rest of them have been, they go through legal hoops, and then at the last, their submission is rejected. Now, my question is this: the actions that impair the climate, the actions that impair the ocean by the Republican Trump administration are absolutely enormous compared to previous administrations. Is there anything in this, or I suppose in the withdrawing of the UN Framework Climate Change Convention, that these young people might be able to use?
The principles that have been now fully recognized by the International Court of Justice are usable in various actions that can be brought in various jurisdictions. I can say that I am considering a couple such actions right now. I can't talk in detail about them, but in all of them, I will draw directly on the principles as formulated by the International Court of Justice. This is very important with respect to any action brought against the United States government, because as we're going to talk about in more detail, as Herb already mentioned, earlier this month on January 7, the Trump administration announced that it will withdraw the United States from the Framework Convention. And so the fact that, according to the World Court, the fundamental legal obligation survives even a withdrawal. I mean, they didn't speak specifically to withdrawal, but they said that this duty comes to us under international law, not merely because of the so-called climate treaties, but because of background principles of international law, which I talked about before. So yes, they can be referred to. They are not directly enforceable, in my opinion, in any United States court. But courts should, I believe, attend to the fact that the World Court issued this advisory opinion.
Thank you, Dan.
Okay, so let me turn it over to Paul. Welcome as always, Paul. Floor is yours.
So, Dan, you used the expression the most important authority in the world. Can you clarify, are you referring to the UN in general or just the International Court of Justice?
I was referring to the International Court of Justice with respect to its determination as to the obligation of states with respect to climate change. What are the legal duties? The ICJ, Paul, as you probably know, is a function. It's an arm, but I was referring specifically to the court.
Okay, so many people have a different viewpoint, including your government, right? The US federal government said there's no authority or no they're just ignoring any findings at international courts or UN findings, including the UNFCCC treaties and stuff. They're just so the reality is that these organizations, one would think that they're being severely weakened by US withdrawal, but then on the other side of the coin, maybe these organizations should have kicked out the US for their views. You mentioned that the US withdrew from 66 international organizations. Don't these organizations have any strength? And if a country is a rogue country, just kick them out and then get on to your business with all of the people that respect your organization. So the US being a member of all these organizations has been detrimental, I think, to these organizations over the years. I mean, the US is basically a rogue state. It's a fossil fuel state. It's denying basic science of climate change. It's spreading disinformation around the world. So good riddance to them, I would say. The world needs to become stronger. I mean, Trump's policy is clearly divide and conquer, trying to set agreements by state, US negotiating with, say, one country over one issue, and then pick the next country. I guess the question leads to, when I say the US government, who's really in charge here? Is Trump really in charge, or are there hidden groups that are setting policy? I'm talking about Agenda 2025, etc. The far right, people working behind the scenes. Is Trump actually the one up at 2 or 3 in the morning sending out hundreds of tweets or social media? What's happening now is not working for the rest of the world. Last week, the whole world was focused on Greenland and what Trump might do. This week, the whole world is focused on what's happening in Minneapolis, the power of ICE, the increasing budgets. Their budgets doubled in the last year. If you took the amount of money that the Trump administration is putting to ICE, it's like a paramilitary force. The money going to them is higher than the defense budgets of all the countries in the world except for 15, the 15 largest. And that's only supposed to increase. The Atlantic had a great article called Yes, It's Fascism. It's about the US government. It was published January 25th by Jonathan Rauch, Rauch, in the Atlantic. This divide and conquer, it goes back 2,500 years, the ancient art of war. Can't people read that and see what's happening? So I would, next week, nobody will remember Minneapolis, because the next threat looks like it's going to be probably Iran. Let's go bomb the heck out of Iran. And then the week after, it'll be something else. Trump is succeeding in occupying the minds of people around the world, following him. And how do we break this chain? Clearly, from your perspective, how can you argue that the UN International Criminal Justice Court is the most important authority in the world when the most powerful country in the world has no respect for the organization? So that's not a realistic operating statement. So that's my question. I mean, climate change is just one part of it. You've mentioned withdrawal from 66 international organizations. The US is becoming just inward looking. America first, the byline from America first means every other country is second class or second. I mean, we've seen all this before. We just have to look at history. We have to go back to the 1930s, pre-World War II, right? So I think people need a wake-up call of what's happening, not just on the UN organizations, the climate-related also climate's dropped off the cliff. Okay, in America right now, 1.5 million United States people, citizens, are without electrical power. They've been without electricity since Sunday. During the worst of the storm, that number was about 1 or 1.5 million households, which is 4.5 million people. You know, do you see any news articles or stuff about this? I mean, when the media is controlled, we're not getting that information. So we have a huge problem here. I guess so this is only one aspect. We're only scratching the surface by talking about the UNFCCC.
So, Paul, sprinkled in that tremendous statement were about 27 different questions. Very powerful statement, and I certainly agree with the sentiments. By the way, I did read the Atlantic article. I just want to respond to a few things. While I largely agree with much of what you said, I strongly disagree. We will remember Minneapolis. We'll never forget Minneapolis. And not only because of the instances of cruelties, which will certainly be dwarfed by the next invasion, for example, but because of the way in which ordinary people stood up and are standing up today and will stand up tomorrow in Minneapolis. It's been remarkable. And that is a bright light in a dark moment in current history in the United States. Secondly, it's important to remember that Trump is not the United States. I do believe that it is he, or perhaps he and Stephen Miller, who are tweeting at 3:25 a.m. But I do believe that he is directly involved, if not the sole originator of these commands and tweets and various things that issue at all hours of the day and evening under his name. By the way, it's the International Court of Justice. It's not the International Criminal Court. I think you said International Criminal Justice Court or something like that. But the United States also is disavowing the authority of the International Criminal Court, which also meets in The Hague and is subject to recurrent attacks in a number of ways, including through funding and threats from this particular administration. So is the world better off without delegations from this particular administration going to the annual conferences of the parties? Yeah, probably. But that's a short-term thing. It still is, in my opinion, and I'd like to talk about this if we have a chance today, it is quite a bad thing for the world's major historical emitter of greenhouse gases to be withdrawing from the international system. It's also a very bad thing for the world's largest military to be withdrawing from the international rules-based order, treating the United Nations Charter, for example, as if it's a scrap piece of paper. What we do matters, and our withdrawal from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, if nothing else, I believe is going to encourage other nations who hope to be strongly allied with the United States to consider their own withdrawal or at least non-participation. So yeah, we have a major problem. The United States is doing more than just trying to tear up this particular treaty. As I noted in my article, and as you specified, there are 66 different conventions and organizations that the White House withdrew from on January 7th, but also perhaps not coincidentally, it was that evening that Trump held the press conference in which he told the New York Times, among others, that he felt unconstrained with respect to any international law operating in any way in the world. And so he was asked, well, is there any constraint on you that you will recognize? And on that night, he said, well, only my own morality, for what that is worth. He didn't say for what that is worth, but that's what he said. So we're in a very, very dark time. And I don't mean in focusing here today with you on the UNFCCC withdrawal to imply that that is the most important development. It just happens to be among my very few areas of expertise.
Paul, any other comments?
I just think that this reinforces the idea that we're not going to stop burning fossil fuels. We're going to keep putting CO2, other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So we absolutely have to come up with technologies to pull it out of the atmosphere. The hardships, which those 1.5 Americans that are without power for going on for 3-4 days, no electricity. Climate change doesn't care about policies of the US government or any other country. We're getting more and more extremes. We're going to have more and more scarcity, more and more inflation for food, etc. We're going to not have any choice but to try to cool the planet somehow. I have to take objection to China being labeled the enemy of the West. That's absurd. China's doing more on climate change than anybody else on the planet. They're run by STEM people in government, in policy, scientists, technology, engineer, mathematicians. They're run by science people. Now, that hasn't always worked in human history, but I think it's better than running, having unqualified people that don't know the science running countries. So we can't give up hope, of course, but I think we have to recognize that we're in a very dark geopolitical time right now. And for us to put all of our hope in midterms or, in an election 2029, I think that's the wrong viewpoint, because I don't see how we're going to have fair elections in the US. I think it's just heading southwards, and I think more people need to recognize the crisis for what it is and what's wrong with a national strike in the US. People are slowly awakening to the threat. Europe has just been awakened to the threats with the Greenland stuff going on, and they suffered under fascist Germany. They were at war with them in Europe. It was fought there, so their cities were destroyed. I mean, they're much more attuned to this threat than we are, and I think they've had an awakening with the Greenland thing. We don't have crystal balls on the future, but things are very dark, and why should we expect them to get better in the short term at least?
Dan, any response to Paul? And if not, or along with that, are there other messages that you want to convey to our audience about the withdrawal, about your legal work, anything else relevant to today's discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to address the withdrawal and the importance of that and those basic questions if we still have time. But in a quick response to Paul, we are in a very dark time, but I don't agree that we are not going to phase out fossil fuels in energy systems. I think that we will need to do that as well. It's not to say that we don't also need to figure out how to remove excess CO2 from the atmosphere or from flue gas for that matter. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be considering other ways of cooling the planet, but I think that we need to do that. And I think that we will do that. It's just we have this major departure right now that we have to contend with. It's a challenge not only to the United Nations framework system, but the entire rules-based order and to the presumption that democracy is secure in the United States. So on to the question then of what the United States did on January 7. I first need to say that as of last night, the United States had not formally filed its notification to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change depository. We have not formally withdrawn from the convention. I expect that that will happen, but it hasn't happened yet. As we indicated before, these things, once the formal notification is done, are not immediately effective. So, for example, the United States did withdraw formally from the Paris Agreement to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change on January 27 of 2025. But it wasn't effective until yesterday, that is the 27th of January. Well, so too with respect to a formal withdrawal from the convention itself. The time clock starts on the day that notification is provided to the convention secretariat. And then it is not effective for 12 months. So I think it's important to know that the directive of the presidential memorandum did not actually tell the State Department to formally withdraw. All that presidential memorandum said was that we should withdraw, and the definition of withdrawal in that document was cease participating and going to meetings of the entity. So it's possible that, consistent with the presidential memorandum, the directive from Trump, we could formally remain in and not participate, similar to what the United States did at COP30. We were still part of the convention, but the United States declined to send a delegation. That's what they could continue to do. That would certainly be my preference. I hope that they do not formally withdraw. As I said, I think that it would be a dramatic, symbolic step in the wrong direction. In addition, it would mean that we renounce all our obligations under the convention, including to report on an annual basis our emissions to the registry of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I'd like to say one other thing too. I'm sorry that this is a little technical, but the one question I think that might be raised, and I'll raise it here now, is whether it's lawful for the White House, President Trump, to unilaterally withdraw from the convention. After all, it was signed in 1992 and then received the ratification vote, the advice and consent of the Senate 4 months after. It was signed in June of 1992, and in October of 1992, the Senate, by a margin of 92-0, approved of the United States ratifying the treaty, and then President George H.W. Bush then filed articles of ratification, consistent with the United States Constitution, which also states that treaties, and this is a treaty, are the supreme law of the land. Well, what does it mean for the president to be able to withdraw from the supreme law of the land? There are three sources of the supreme law of the land: the United States Constitution itself, statutes and other laws, such as common law issued by the Supreme Court, and interpreting statutes, and treaties. Well, the president can't just rip up all or a section of the United States Constitution. He cannot formally, on his own, just withdraw from the Constitution. President also cannot simply withdraw from any law. The president is duty-bound to honor and enforce the law, to take care that the law is enforced. Of course, at some points, including recently, perhaps that duty is being honored in the breach, not being honored at all. And so similarly, should the president be able to simply withdraw from a treaty where the Senate has given its advice and consent? That legal issue has never been squarely faced by our Supreme Court. And I think it's perhaps a case might make it up there. Now, in particular, a case could go to the courts testing this proposition, especially if the Senate now were to act to pass a resolution disapproving of withdrawal. Or, for example, there could be a rider in an appropriations bill. That is to say, a piece of the upcoming appropriations bill, an amendment to it, could bar the United States from withdrawing from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And if that were to happen, then there would be an actual case or conflict, and it could be perhaps heard by a federal court. So that's how this whole thing could make its way into court. So anyhow, that's perhaps a bit of a technical considerations, but I think it's important for people to understand that Trump is not the whole government. There are other branches of the United States government in a federalist system, including the legislative branch. And the legislative branch is comprised of both the House of Representatives and the United States Senate. And the Constitution specifically vests authority equally with respect to treaty-making authority in the President and the United States Senate. So here I would just hope that the Senate, which is quite busy on a number of counts, but this is important too, will not quietly just stand aside, but it will have a say in this important question whether the United States is going to continue to be a party to the convention.
Well, thank you for that, Dan. The viewers watching this, I think definitely, I would think, are getting the importance of what you're saying. And, that this is not just, as you put it, technical. This goes to the heart of democracy. Who makes decisions? Who can enforce them? And of course, we've had this whole situation in the United States where both the legislature and the courts have, for various reasons, deferred much more than many of us have been comfortable with to this particular executive. Would it be worthwhile, as a kind of final question to you, for those who are viewing, particularly those in the United States, to contact their congressional and senatorial representatives and urge them to address this issue? Because again, this has larger implications than simply whether you support climate or not. I mean, these treaties and so forth cover every aspect. And as you yourself have said, the U.S. supposedly, or Mr. Trump, is pulling out of dozens of international agreements of one sort or another. What would you advise our viewers to do who want to do more than just listen and shake their hands and say we have to do something?
Yes, well, of course, at CPR Initiative, we are considering our various options as to what we wish to urge people to do. But certainly, I would say at this time, this is an important juncture to be contacting, particularly your senators, but
Right.
also members of the House of Representatives should hear as well. Generally, that we believe that the United States should not be withdrawing from the rules-based order. That is to say, we should be part of critical international institutions through which the nations can work in cooperation to resolve important problems, and in particular here, with respect to the overriding problem of dangerous climate change. We have a climate treaty on this planet. It is a universal treaty. There are 194 parties, mostly nations, some international organizations, that are parties to it. No nation, once a party, has ever withdrawn from the Framework Convention on Climate Change. We should not be the first. And if we are the first, others probably will follow. It's important to keep this thing together. The rest of the world can work quite well, even in our absence, for the next 3 years. But it's, I think, critically important that the next administration should be able to simply rejoin the convention, and a action by the United States Senate establishing its disapproval of the notion that the United States should be unilaterally withdrawing from the Framework Convention without even any authorization by the United States Senate is really anathema to the fundamental tenets of our democracy in the United States, which is supposed to be a system of checks and balances where there are co-equal branches of government, and the legislative branch of government is one of those three co-equal branches. It needs to be a co-equal branch, not only formally, but actually. The Senate needs to stand up, in my opinion.
Well, that's very passionate and eloquent, and I'm sure our viewers will take that to heart and, again, contact their senators if they're in the United States. And maybe at the next COP, the court decision can be highlighted, unlike what happened in Belém. And I just want to also acknowledge something we haven't mentioned today, which is that you and Dr. Hansen played a role in preparing some information that I believe was sent to the court with regard to the decision. And so, we want to thank you not just for talking about this, but for putting together the legal research and traveling to the venue, as I understand it, on behalf of one of the smaller countries to actually file some documents that helped influence the very progressive decision that they made. So our hats off to you, Dan. Really appreciate you coming. I feel better knowing that you're out there in the background above the clouds, but you're actually below the clouds in real life, working all this stuff. There's no easy, quick answer to any of this, but the fact that it isn't easy or quick doesn't mean that we take our foot off the electric, I won't say the gas, as we move forward. So again, hats off to you. I know I speak for Paul. And Peter, you're always welcome to return. We hope you will. We hope you'll keep us posted, and we in turn will keep our viewers posted on the progress that you are making. And we also hope that you will intervene with your colleague, Dr. Hansen, so that he can come on board before too long. I know he's still finishing up his book, but I know you're very close to him. And we have had him on before, and we're eager to hear his latest thinking as well.
Well,
So
thank you
with that,
very much. I really appreciate it. And look, these are dark days, but we've come through worse in human history. And increasingly, people are energized, including yourselves, people all around, not only in Minneapolis.
Mhm.
The world is starting to pay attention, as Paul rightly noted. And so it's important, I think, to recognize what's in front of us, but also to not give up hope. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you again, Dan. Okay, let me segue to the climate five for this week. Number one is that there is a landmark North Sea offshore wind pact that was recently signed and which is really big, big news in terms of the renewable transition. 10 European countries have announced what many are calling a landmark pact to build not just offshore wind farms, but an integrated offshore wind power grid across the North Sea. When completed, this system is expected to deliver 100 gigawatts of offshore wind power, which is, if you translate that into terms that many of us need to understand it, enough electricity to supply 143 million homes. That's right, you heard that correctly, 143 million homes in 10 European countries. So I encourage you to look more about that and see the scale of the renewable transition that is underway. A contrast with that, and in many of our climate fives, we have contrasts between positive and not so positive information, is that the Trump Department of Energy announced that they are canceling nearly $30 billion in Department of Energy financing, affecting a wide range of wind and solar projects, whose list they actually haven't announced to the public yet. It's difficult to overstate the long-term implications of withdrawing this level of clean energy support, but we hope again also that the Senate, the House, the courts will do everything they can to turn this back and get these projects back where they belong. Number three, there's been new research on permafrost fires and the carbon budget. Comes from a new paper in a journal called Communications Earth and Environment. Researchers have concluded that when emissions from permafrost thaw and wildfires are fully accounted for, the already tiny remaining carbon budget for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C shrinks by another 25% just from permafrost and wildfires. These kind of feedbacks that make it so much more difficult for us to rely solely on emission reductions. Of course, many people, analysts and others, are recognizing that we may not actually have any carbon budget left, that in fact we have what could be called a carbon debt, and that we're well past the point where we can remain at 1.5. But that's something we've talked about before and we'll be talking about again. The fourth story, ExxonMobil is at it again. They have made a proposal, an accounting proposal, but a very important one, to shift liability to consumers. They have created, along with other groups, an initiative called Carbon Measures, which is reshaping, or they hope will reshape, how the world counts climate responsibility. Independent analysts have warned that the proposed system would shift liability for fossil fuel emissions away from the producers of those fossil fuels and onto the consumers. That's right, to you and to I, essentially dispersing responsibility across millions of individuals rather than placing it on the companies. In other words, the buck would not stop at the top, it would land squarely on each of us. So that's another thing to keep in mind, and hopefully that can be pushed back on. And last story sort of about climate messaging, a topic we're going to address in greater depth in an upcoming program with the climate psychology expert Margaret Klein Solomon. And that Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, and that is his last name, Whitehouse, of Rhode Island, who I've had the opportunity to personally chat with and who many recognize as probably the strongest climate voice in the United States Senate. Recently, he wrote about what he called climate hushing by Democratic strategists, political advisors who argue that Democrats need to talk less about climate change. As the world gets hotter and hotter, we should talk about it less and less. And that's not what he is articulating. He's articulating the exact opposite. But he's described closed door presentations on Capitol Hill where climate wasn't mentioned at all. And he's warned that when leaders stop talking about an issue, public enthusiasm drops. In politics, he notes, You can create your own wind or your own doldrums, depending upon whether you choose to speak up or not. And I know, Dan, you've told us some contact with his office. I have enormous admiration for him, and we hope maybe he can take the lead on some of the initiatives that we've talked about today. So with that, I want to thank, as always, Peter and Paul. Thank you again, Dan. Wish you all good energy and luck and support from us and from our community as you do the important work. And with that, we look forward, as always, to seeing you next week. Thank you so much. Goodbye.